Two famous actor brothers couldn't have been more different. One was named Edwin and the other one John. In 1863, both of them, along with their brother Junius, performed in the play Julius Caesar. That John took the role of Brutus, and it was an eerie harbinger of what awaited the brothers and this country just 2 years later. This same John who played the assassin Brutus in Julius took on the same role of assassin in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. On Good Friday in 1865, he stole quietly into the presidential box as our American cousin was being performed on stage, fired one bullet into the brain of Abraham Lincoln, and of course Lincoln died. The last names of the brothers was Booth. John Wilkes Booth was the first person to successfully assassinate an American president. Now his brother Edwin was never the same after that night. Shame from John's murder of Lincoln drove him into retirement. He might have never returned to the stage had it not been for what happened in a New Jersey train station. Edwin was waiting for a train when a well-dressed young man pressed past the crowd, lost his footing, and fell between the platform and an oncoming train. Without any hesitation, Edwin locked his leg around the rail, grabbed the man, and pulled him to safety. After sighs of relief, the young man recognized the famous Edwin Booth. But Booth did not recognize the man he rescued. Knowledge of who the man was came weeks later in a letter that Edwin carried in his pocket to his grave. It was a letter from an army general who thanked him for saving the life of Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln. While one brother killed the president, another saved his son. Well, there's another story about two men. They were not brothers, but both were rulers. One was the governor of Judea, the other was called the King of the Jews. One gave the final decision to murder a man, the other one saved the whole world. These two men represent what we decide to do with the greatest gift God has ever given to the world, and that's Jesus Christ. Our decision about God's gift is seen in which water basin we choose in life. Jesus presents us with a choice. It's the choice to either reject Him or to serve Him. This is not a choice you can avoid. You must decide either for or against Him. This is life's greatest choice. As Erwin McManus says, the most spiritual thing you will do today is to choose. And whether you realize it or not, every choice you make has an effect on your future. And those choices that come out of, and all of those choices come out of the one choice about Jesus Christ. The choice you make about Jesus is the material from which your future is made. You know that it's true. The decision you make about Jesus determines all the significant decisions of your life. Consider Pilate first. What does he do with his basin? Well, we find out in Matthew chapter 27. This is what it says. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I've suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "Well, what shall I do then with Jesus, who's called Christ?" They answered, "Crucify him." "Well, why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I'm innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It's your responsibility." Now Pilate was the Roman procurator or governor of Judea for about 10 years. He reported directly to the emperor. He was not popular with the Jewish people because he had a knack for agitating and insulting his subjects. The Jewish people hated graven images. The Roman standards or banners had the Roman eagle or sometimes the image of the emperor on top. And earlier governors, before Pilate, had learned to remove these images from the top of their banners before marching into a Jewish city. Well, not Pilate. As the saying goes, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. On one occasion, Pilate had marched into Caesarea with banners bearing the Roman image. There was such a bitter opposition that he was forced to remove the images or he would have a riot on his hands. And Rome would not be happy about that. So Pilate relented. Another time, Pilate decided that Jerusalem needed a better water supply, which was true. His foolishness came in with how he decided to pay for it. He built a new aqueduct, but he stole money from the temple treasury to cover the costs. This created such an uproar that his very position was threatened. So he had Roman soldiers dressed like Jewish civilians, armed with hidden clubs, mingle with the shouting crowd that was wanting to get rid of him. And so at a prearranged signal, they attacked the crowd, injuring and killing many people. You know, Pilate could be ruthless. Even though he was a constant thorn in people's side, he feared them at the same time. His reputation with the Jews stunk. If he made one wrong move, Rome would be embarrassed and he would be recalled. So early one morning, he was called to a meeting by the high priest, and it was an emergency, he was told. And so Pilate came to this meeting, but he resented it. He was thinking, you know, with these Jews, you know, everything is an emergency. These religious types are always fierce when it comes to their beliefs and traditions. They can't be reasoned with. I wonder what they want now. For the first time, he was brought face to face with Jesus. Pilate was full of questions about this man. If you look at the context of the passage there in Matthew 27, Jesus asked, or Pilate rather, asked a half a dozen questions. These questions are a dilemma that he faces. You know, what is he to do with the King of the Jews? What is he to do with this man? This is the question of all questions that every one of us must answer. What will I do with Jesus Christ? Let me rephrase that. What are you doing with Jesus Christ? What you do with Jesus is going to affect everything else in your life. How you respond to Jesus is going to determine your entire future. The people were shouting for the death sentence. Crucify him! Crucify him! We either choose Christ or we crucify him. You can't do both. So the question is, what am I to do with Jesus Christ? It will not go away. No other person in history forces a decision from us the way that Jesus does. The religious leaders could not escape a decision about him. The crowd could not escape a decision about him. Pilate could not escape a decision about him. You cannot escape a decision about him. What will you do with Jesus Christ? What will you do with him? And what will you let him do with you? Well, Pilate was impressed with Jesus. He didn't take seriously the claim that he was the king of the Jews. He knew a revolutionary, you know, might call him a troublemaker, when he saw one, and this man wasn't. There was something about the person of Jesus he could not avoid. Jesus' silence in the face of the accusations made Pilate feel like it was he, not Jesus, who was on trial. We are not just seeing Jesus on trial before the crowd, but Pilate on trial before Jesus. It's as if Jesus' searchlight is probing his soul, revealing his true character for the whole world to see. He was on trial for who he would please. Would he please himself? Would he please the crowd? Or would he please God? Pilate was impressed with Jesus, but he had no intention of doing what would please Jesus. Well, in John's account of the trial, Jesus does give some answers to Pilate. John 18:37, Jesus says, "For this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Well, this is when Pilate asked the question that he's most famous for. What is truth? Pilate was not willing to discover the truth. He wasn't so much interested in the truth about Jesus as he was in figuring out how to get the crowd off of his back. Instead of facing the truth, he was doing everything he could to avoid the truth. What is truth? That is the question of the hour. People don't seem to know what truth is anymore. Many people question whether there is such a thing as absolute truth. When they say there absolutely isn't, well, they just said an absolute truth. Others think of truth as what is true for me, or what I feel is the truth, regardless of what the objective reality says otherwise. So truth is manipulated by educators, politicians, public figures, famous people, the media, your neighbor, anybody who decides to put a twist on the truth or what it means to live by it. Most people are really clueless about the truth. As Jesus said, everyone who's on the side of truth listens to me. He was saying, you can find out the truth. You can find out the truth about me. In fact, he said in John 7:16 and 17, my teaching is not my own. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He's saying, put into practice what I teach, and you're going to discover this is from God. And it will help you know God. If Pilate really wanted to know the truth about Jesus, he could have found out if he'd only looked further into Jesus, if he'd only been willing to listen to Jesus, if only he'd allowed Jesus to speak to his soul and reveal the truth to him. But Pilate refused to wrestle with the truth and what he really believed. What surely grieves the heart of God is when we refuse to listen to the truth, when we're unwilling to look into the truth about Jesus and thereby discover the truth about everything else. You can find out the truth about Jesus, and when you do, it will change your life. It will change your destiny. It will change your legacy. Do you really want to know the truth about Jesus? You know, many people have set out to try and disprove Jesus, and some of those same people have ended up embracing Jesus. Have you looked into the truth, or are you just going along with the crowd like Pilate? Well, he was afraid of the crowd. You know, do you do what the crowd wants you to do? If you do that, it's almost guaranteed to be the wrong thing. But Pilate wouldn't listen to anybody but the crowd. He didn't listen to his own conscience. He didn't listen to his wife who warned him after her dream about Jesus. He didn't listen to the voice of God speaking into his heart. Instead, he listened to his insecurities, his fears, even the voice of the devil. As with Pilate, when you're in a position to decide about Jesus, there are powerful forces at play. You must want Jesus more than you want anything or anybody else. There's a high price to pay if you're going to follow Jesus. And Satan will whisper lies about him in your ear, in your heart. The pressures of this world and the people will try to pull hard against you. There's one thing you cannot do with Jesus. You cannot avoid a response. Truth always demands a response. Like Pilate, we must answer two questions. Who is Jesus? Is he the way, the truth, and the life, as he claims to be? Is he the Son of God who died in my place for my sins so that I can live fully for him right now and for all eternity? And once we decide who Jesus is, then we've got to answer Pilate's question. What do I do with Jesus? Will we evade him and continue to be uncommitted to him, or will we surrender to him as the Lord and director of our lives? Well, Pilate decided to wash his hands of Jesus. A pastor tells about a church that was doing a prayer walk using several stations that people would stop along the way. Sort of like the Stations of the Cross, if you've ever participated in that. At one station, people read the story of Pilate and were to wash their hands in a basin and dry them with the towel. What they didn't know was that the water had been treated with a special chemical that turned their hands red. Several of the people broke into tears when they realized you cannot wash your hands of Jesus without being guilty of his death. Pilate thought he could exonerate himself by publicly washing his hands of Jesus. Moral guilt, however, does not wash off in a bowl of water. God is the only one who can remove the stains of a guilty soul. To wash your hands of Jesus is a failure with eternal consequences. Will you welcome Jesus wholeheartedly into your life, or like Pilate, will you wash your hands of him? The entire story between the week of Palm Sunday and Easter can be told with two basins. With one basin, like the one Pilate used, you wash your hands of Jesus. But there's another basin. There are two basins, but you must choose one. In fact, you can only choose one. And so we find out about the second basin in John chapter 13. John writes, it was before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and return to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the table, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel wrapped around him. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example, that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." So Jesus doesn't use a towel and a basin to wash his hands of the disciples. The towel and the basin he uses are really what his whole life was about. He came to serve and give his life as a ransom for every person who puts their trust in him. He even gave his life for those who refused to trust him. He didn't just wash Peter's feet, Judas's feet got washed too. Washing his disciples' feet was what his whole journey from heaven to earth and back to heaven was all about. Now, foot washing was the job that nobody wanted. The foot washer was at the bottom of the pecking order. It's sort of like how things are in a hen house. In the hen house, the most dominant chick pecks on every chicken's head. The next most dominant chicken picks on everybody else except the dominant chicken. And so it goes all the way down the line to the lowest chicken of all. And everyone pecks on her head, and she pecks on nobody else. She's easy to spot. She's the bleeding, bald-headed bird, always looking over her shoulder. She's at the bottom of the pecking order. Well, that was the foot washer, and nobody wanted to be that person. Apparently the foot washer didn't show up at the Last Supper with Jesus. And none of the disciples were going to lower themselves that far. Every one of them was thinking, I'm not going to wash anybody's feet. They were probably thinking that one of the other disciples, maybe a little bit lower on the totem pole in their mind, he should be the one to do it. In Luke's account, he tells a dispute broke out between the disciples about which of them was the greatest. They were probably arguing over who's going to wash feet. That's how you can tell that a person has not bought into Jesus wholeheartedly, because they're always jockeying for position, trying to be king or queen of the hill, or at least above so-and-so, that they could never love enough to serve. You must carefully evaluate how you're thinking about the people around you every day. Who are those people that in your mind you consider yourself above them, that who you would never think of doing something for them, but believe they're the ones who, if anybody, should be doing something for you? Who are the menial persons in your mind that you do not love with the sacrificial love of Jesus? Jesus says to the disciples, you guys are fighting over the wrong thing. Instead of fighting over who should be the greatest among them, they should be fighting over who is the least and who can serve the others and love them the most. In Luke, Jesus says to them, he says, but you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. That's when Jesus gets up from the table and does the most shocking thing. He takes off his outer garment, which means he's standing there in his underwear. He wraps a towel around his waist. He picks up the basin and he starts washing feet. Nobody would have expected Jesus to do this. Now, I can't prove what I'm about to say, but it would be just like Jesus to start with Judas's feet. The one who would most seriously betray Jesus is the one he would be the first to love and serve. Peter's reaction to Jesus was, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. It's as if Jesus is saying, Peter, if you do not let me be who I am, if you do not let me stoop down and cleanse you, you cannot enter my kingdom, and you won't end up following me. You won't do what I do. Peter, something needs to be done to you that only I can do, and unless you let me do it, you do not belong to me. As Max Lucado says, to place our feet into the basin of Jesus is to place the filthiest part of our life into his hands. One believer says, growing up, I don't remember a lot about my grandfather on my mom's side, but I do remember his feet. He and my grandma had divorced well before I was born, and he passed away while I was still pretty young. My memories of him are few, but like I said, I remember his feet. I remember his feet because he had no toes. He had diabetes, and as a result of all his toes had been removed. He had been remarried for some years, and when I was young, we would visit a couple of times a year. As a kid, I thought his feet were fascinating, but they were a little bit scary to me. I didn't know what to make of feet with no toes. I had this vivid memory of my step-grandma always tending and taking care of those feet. I remember this one time when we were visiting and my grandfather didn't have socks on. At one point in our conversation, she got up from the living room, and when she came back, she had his socks in her hand. With a huge smile on her face, she said to my grandpa, "Give me those feet." She started to put his socks on him, and then just sat there, holding those feet in her lap. I knew she loved my grandpa by the way she said, "Give me those feet." I knew she loved my grandpa because of how she held those feet, how she cared about the part of him that was the most broken. We all have broken parts of ourselves that we'd rather not have anybody see. This was true for the disciples too. In that room that night were hearts full of contradiction. There were people saying the right things outwardly, but inwardly they were plotting evil. That was Judas. There were other people with the best of intentions, but when push came to shove in the hours ahead, fear would get the best of them, and they would do the very thing they promised they would not do. And one of those was Peter. Later that night, Jesus told the group, "One of you is going to betray me." Now, he was talking about Judas, but apparently Judas was not such an obvious choice to everybody else. The disciples stared at one another, not knowing which of them it might be. It was as if Jesus was reading their minds. They thought, what if we're confused because deep down, it's me. I'm the one. Does he know about the things that I've done? Does he know about my doubts? Did he find out about my secret sin? Does he know where my thoughts sometimes drift to places I would be ashamed for anybody else to find out? Is it me? Well, Jesus tells Peter, and he tells us, I have to wash your feet. In a few days, when you're at your lowest moment, when you're feeling more shame than you ever felt in your life, when you feel alone and unworthy of love, you'll be glad I washed your feet. You will need this moment when the worst of you was exposed and you were loved in that place. You need this moment when you knew I loved all of you, not just your clean hands or your presentable face, but all of you. Not just your achievements and your intellect and your wittiness. I loved all of that, but I love your feet. See, that's fully loving. That's loving to the greatest possible extent. That's loving to the end. Now, Peter, give me those feet. So which wash basin are you picking up? You're either washing your hands of Jesus, or you're letting Jesus wash all of you, love all of you, change all of you. And if you're picking up Jesus' towel and basin, you'll be doing the same thing Jesus has done for you. You'll be loving them like Jesus loves you. You'll be serving like Jesus serves. Even those that you tend to consider to be the least, who you think are undeserving, even those who might betray you. That kind of love, that kind of service shows you that you too carry Jesus' towel and basin. Well, here's how one set of believers did that. They said, we set up at the beach boardwalk in Santa Cruz at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There were just a handful of us. We chose a spot right at the entrance to the beach. Our supplies consisted of 2 fold-up chairs, 2 plastic containers, paper towels, liquid dial soap, a 5-gallon jug to haul water, and a heart for people. Our opening line went something like this. Hi, would you like to sit down and let us rinse the sand off your feet? Well, we had very few refusals. In fact, people were lining up. We took about 3 minutes with each person. We silently prayed as we worked, but when asked, about 95% of the people let us pray out loud with them. Well, there were many heart-touching encounters that day, but there's one I will always remember. One gentleman from an Asian background kept calling one of our team members Jesus. When I tried to correct him and explain who Jesus was, he replied, I know who Jesus is, and you are just like him. May we be just like you, Jesus, that we may pick up the wash basin that you came for us to carry when we are carrying you in our lives. That we may love you with all that we are and serve others with all that you've given us. We pray during this week as we recall what you did for us. May we follow you and do for others as you have asked us to do for you. We pray this